Today's learning target is I can use the fundamental counting principle to find the number of possible outcomes. Today we're going to talk about the fundamental counting principle. And what this says, the fundamental counting principle, is that if one event has a certain number of outcomes and then another event has a certain number of outcomes, then the total possible outcomes can be found by multiplying the two numbers. Now here's what that means. If we were to flip a coin like this one, we know that when we flip it, one of the outcomes could be it could land on heads, the other could land on tails. Right? There's two possible outcomes if we flip that coin. Now if we roll this die here, there's 6 possible outcomes, right? The numbers 1 through 6 could come up, so there's 6 possible outcomes. So if we wanted to find out the total number of possible outcomes, we just multiply those two numbers, which would be 12. So there are 12 different ways that if we flipped a coin and rolled a die, there's 12 different ways that 12 different outcomes that could happen. So it could be heads and 1, heads and 2, heads and 3, 4, 5, or 6. Or it could be tails and 1, tails and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 12 different outcomes. So let's use the fundamental counting principle to see how many different combinations that a person could wear if they had 5 different pairs of pants, 3 different colors of socks, and 10 different types of shoes. So the fundamental counting principle says there are 5 possible outcomes of pants, 3 for shoes, and 3 for socks, and 10 for shoes, which says that to find the total number of outcomes, I could just multiply those numbers together. So if I did that here, I know this is 30 times 5 would be 150 possible combinations for 5 pairs of pants, 3 different pairs of socks, and 10 different pairs of shoes. So let's say that you had a problem where you were asked to find the number of possible outcomes of rolling 3 dice at one time. So for this I would use the fundamental counting principle, and in my head I would envision 3 dice, and I need to figure out the total number of outcomes for that. So I figure out how many outcomes each die has. So die number 1, there would be 6 outcomes. It could be 1 through 6. Die 2 would have 6 outcomes, and die 3 would have 6 outcomes. Now I know from what I did earlier, I'm just going to multiply those together. And when I do that, I get 36 here times 6, and that is 218. So there would be 218 combos for that.
You might know somebody who likes to play the lottery. And one of the things that people may not be aware of is just how many possible outcomes there are when you buy a lottery ticket. Now, in this lottery ticket over here, it looks like people are picking, looks like about 6 numbers here, and the numbers can range anywhere from, it looks like probably all the way from 1 up to maybe 60 or so. So a lot of different possible combinations. So let's look at that on a smaller scale. So let's say that you're asked to pick a 4-digit number or write a 4-digit number, and those digits could be from 0 to 9. Now, if we wanted to find all the possible outcomes, we'd use the fundamental counting principle. So we'd look and we'd say, all right, in this first digit, we could have the numbers from between 0 to 9. So that's 10 possible options. Okay, there would be 10 possible options here, here, and here. So now I would multiply those together because that would tell me how many possible outcomes there are, and that would give me a 1 with 4 zeros, or 10,000 different possible outcomes of numbers. So if I choose one of those numbers, I have a 1 in 10,000 chance. Now let's say the rules changed a little, and every time a number was used, it couldn't be used again, right? So let's say a 3 came up in the first one here. That means a 3 couldn't come up in any of the other spots. So in that case, we'd start off, there'd be 10 possibilities. right? And then one of those gets used, so now there's 9 possibilities for this one. And now 2 numbers have been used, so there's 8 possible here and 7 possible here. Now I would multiply those to find how many possible outcomes. And when I multiply that, I get 5,040. So it cut down on my number of outcomes by quite a bit, but still very, very little chance that I would pick that correct. Now you have to figure here, take a look, they're using such big numbers, there's so many possibilities that the probability of hitting these numbers is going to be astronomical. So when we know how to calculate the possible outcomes, we can find the probability.